Hey everyone. Today we're going to talk about the heart. And an interesting question that might come to mind right now for you is why are we going to talk about the heart in such detail? Because you might have noticed that I'm going to have this video on the heart, I'm going to have another video on the electrical system of the heart, and I'm going to have another video on heart disease. So we're going to spend a fair amount of time discussing the heart. Why? Well, one is because it's super interesting and it allows us to understand human physiology, I think, a little bit better. The other is because the heart defines life and death. What I mean is, by definition, when your heart stops functioning, you're dead. And if your heart is functioning, you're alive. So the heart ends up being kind of central to our interest in health. But the real reason is because 1 in 5 deaths in the United States is the result of heart failure. And heart disease is extremely common in the United States and globally. It is a major killer. And again, to some degree, everyone dies of heart failure. Whatever else is going on, the actual death comes when your heart stops. So we are, in this sense, very interested in the wellness of the heart. So here's an image that gives you a basic idea of how the heart works. I don't want to start with a crazy image like that, but I kind of want to get a sense of where the heart is. I know that that image, if you haven't looked at a heart before, is somewhat overwhelming, but I want you to understand a few basic things. One is that the heart is really 2 pumps. We think of it as one pump, but it's really 2 pumps in one body. So in the middle of that video, or that image, you'll notice that on the left there, where it's sort of bluish, and that's the right atrium. Why is the right atrium on the left? Because we're looking at the heart as though it's in a patient. So imagine a patient looking back at us with that heart in her chest, right? That would be her right heart. And then on the right side, the pinkish side, that would be her left heart. So the heart is broken up into a left and right side. In between the two is a septum that divides the right and left side. And the right and left side don't operate independently, but they are basically 2 separate mechanical pumps, pumping blood to different areas. So we'll talk about that, right? Now, on each side, there's an atrium and a ventricle. So that means we have 4 chambers overall, because we've got a right atrium and a right ventricle. We've got a left atrium and a left ventricle. So far, we're okay? The atrium, or the atria, are really pre-pumps. They make sure that the ventricles, which are really the workhorse of the heart, the thing that really pumps the blood, get filled with blood. So basically, the atrium takes in blood into the heart, pumps it into the ventricle to make sure the ventricle gets a full charge of blood, and then the ventricle pumps the blood out of the heart. That's the basics of it, but I want to get into a little bit more detail. So far that doesn't quite make sense. It's okay. Let's go through it step by step. Let's start with this image here. There's the heart, right? I drew an outline of a heart. That's roughly the shape of a heart. And I note there that there's a right side and a left side, and that dotted line in between, that's the septum. That's fairly rigorous connective tissue that separates the right and left side. Every now and then, that septum doesn't fully separate the right and left side, and that's a problem. And you might have heard of somebody, maybe a baby that was born with a hole in the heart. It's not a hole to the outside typically. It's a hole that allows, let's say, the right atrium to connect into the left atrium through the septum. Or worse, is the right ventricle connect into the left ventricle through the septum. And that really gets in the way of the heart operating properly. So if we're talking about a healthy heart, we've basically got a shape something like this. We've got a right side, we've got a left side, and we've got a septum, firm connective tissue separating the two. And then on the right side, we have a right atrium, and on the left side, we have a left atrium. And these are just basically compartments that are surrounded by muscle tissue that can squeeze and pump. So those atria can basically just contract and expand, constrict and expand, and in this way pump blood, and the blood goes into the right atrium from the vena cava. Now the vena cava, you might remember this term, this is the relatively large venous vessel that collects the blood from all the returning veins. So you've got blood, remember, that goes down to your fingers and your toes, right, and your brain and your organs and everything else. And then it comes back up through an inferior vena cava, which is the vena cava for the lower part of your body, and a superior vena cava, which is the vena cava that collects blood from your brain, your chest, basically the upper half of your body, right? The blood collects there, doesn't have much pressure to it, because remember, the returning blood pressure through the venous system is not very high. That flows in to the right atrium. And the right atrium's job is as a pump to draw that relatively low pressure blood into the heart. From there, it goes through a valve called a tricuspid valve, and you can tell why. It's got 3 cusps to it. So the cusp are the leaves there that open and close and allow blood flow to go in only one direction. So this valve basically allows blood to go from the right atrium into the right ventricle, but not the back way. So you can imagine there's 3 flaps that basically close up when blood is trying to flow in the backwards direction. So it allows blood to flow only from the right atrium into the right ventricle. And then out of that right ventricle, which is a big pump, the blood flows out through what's called a pulmonary valve. Okay, so to recap here, the blood pool comes into the vena cava. The vena cava is a large vessel that's collecting blood from all the veins all around your body. The right atrium draws that blood in because it's a pump. It's a chamber of your heart that's drawing in and pumping blood. It draws that blood in. It then constricts and it pushes the blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The blood goes in to the right ventricle, and the right ventricle squeezes from the bottom up, actually. That's why that pulmonary valve is up high there. Squeezes from the bottom up, pushing the blood with some force out of the heart through what's called a pulmonary valve. And a pulmonary valve is one of 2 semi-lunar valves. It does have 3 cusps in it. We don't call it a tricuspid valve, but it looks somewhat like a tricuspid valve. I think I'll show you a picture of it later. But anyways, that's stopping the blood from flowing backwards. So we want the blood to flow in one direction. Now, with the term pulmonary there, you could guess where that blood's going. It's going to the lungs. So at this point, you understand that the whole purpose of the right side of the heart is to draw blood in, the returning venous blood, and to pump it into the lungs. The lungs are going to oxygenate that blood. So the lungs are going to add oxygen to the red blood cells and allow carbon dioxide to get out of the blood. We've talked about this before. And then the blood is going to be drawn from the lungs back to the left atrium. So we're going to have oxygenated blood from the lungs going back into the left atrium. From the left atrium, the blood is going to go through a valve as well into the left ventricle. Now, this valve isn't quite the same, and the reason, in part, is because we've got higher pressures here. Because what's going to happen, if you haven't guessed yet, is that left ventricle is going to pump the blood with enough force to create your pulse, to create the flow of blood, your blood pressure, that pushes blood around your body. That's a pretty high pressure. And so a tricuspid valve there would really have trouble holding up to that pressure. So nature has defined that as a bicuspid valve called a mitral valve. And the reason for that is kind of weird, but mitral, or a mitre, is the hat the Pope wears or bishops wear, and you've probably seen it as like the really tall hat, right? And if you haven't looked at it closely, it's kind of 2 sections to it. There's a tall part in the front and a tall part in the back. So if you looked at it from the top, it'd look kind of split like that valve. So in this case, we have 2 leaves, one on each side, that are firmer, stronger, that stop blood from backflowing from the left ventricle into the left atrium. So again, oxygenated blood comes from the lungs into the left atrium. The left atrium will squeeze it into the left ventricle. It goes through the mitral valve to get into the left ventricle. The mitral valve is a pretty sturdy valve that's going to make sure we don't get backflow of blood into the left atrium. And then from there, it's going to flow out of the aortic valve into the aorta and into the arteries and the arterioles and the capillary beds and everything we talked about before, right? Remember, the aorta is the big burly pipe that's going to deliver blood out of the heart and to the arteries around your body. I've put a dark line around that left ventricle to indicate that it's a burly sort of muscular kind of tissue. That is to say, the left ventricle is generally thicker and stronger and more muscular than the right ventricle. And that makes some sense. The right ventricle is pumping blood to your lungs, relatively close to your heart. Doesn't need a lot of pressure. In fact, if it had too much pressure, it would probably damage the vessels. The left ventricle needs a lot more pressure because it's providing the force necessary to circulate the blood to all the capillaries all around your body. So it's got to be a burlier muscle, right? And that's what the heart is principally. It's just muscle tissue that functions as a pump. And we'll talk in some detail a little later about what that muscle tissue looks like. Okay, around that heart is a sac called a pericardium. What that means is just near the heart. Peri means near, and cardium is the heart. Sometimes called the pericardial sac. And the reason for this is that the heart is moving, right? It's pumping, but it's in your chest. So you can imagine something that's trying to move, surrounded by tissue that's not moving, is going to create some injury. It's going to create some irritation that could, by the way, prompt an inflammatory response and scar tissue that binds everything together and makes it painful every time your heart beats. That's not something you'd want. So nature and evolution has dealt with this by having a sac around your heart. And that sac is filled with a viscous fluid that allows your heart to move without disturbing the surrounding tissue. In other words, the outside of the pericardium is connected with surrounding tissue and doesn't move relative to the surrounding tissue. The inside of the pericardium has a fluid in it, and then your heart inside of that, just a little bit of fluid that allows your heart to move relative to the surrounding tissue without creating irritation or injury. Well, that makes sense, right? You could think of it as like, I don't know, a plastic bag inside of a plastic bag with a little bit of oil between the two that basically allows the inside to move without disturbing the outside. Okay, so how is flow going here? To recap, imagine this is like, I don't know, magic school bus kind of thing, right? We're going to shrink down and we're going to travel through the heart. Okay, where do we begin? We're in the vena cava. We've come back from the venous system, relatively low pressure, relatively slow moving blood in this large this large vein, basically. That's the vena cava. Okay, from there we get drawn in to the right atrium. The right atrium squeezes. That pushes us through the tricuspid valve, that three-leafed valve, into the right ventricle. The right ventricle squeezes, pushing us through a semilunar valve, the pulmonary valve, into the pulmonary artery. It's an artery because it's coming out of the heart, right? Delivering blood out of the heart. It is, by the way, the only artery that has deoxygenated blood. Most arteries are delivering blood with oxygen in it. The blood hasn't been oxygenated yet, so this is deoxygenated blood. From there, we go into the lungs. And the lung tissues, we'll talk about this later, but the lung tissues add oxygen. We know that. Remove carbon dioxide. Great. Now we've got oxygenated blood ready to be recirculated back into the circulatory system. And so we then travel from the lungs back through the pulmonary vein. It's a vein because it's delivering blood to the heart. Through the pulmonary vein, pulmonary just means related to the lungs, pulmonary vein, into the left atrium, the left side of the heart, the other side of the septum. That left atrium takes in that blood, it squeezes, goes through the mitral valve, that's that two-leafed valve that from the top looks like the Pope's hat, I guess, goes through the mitral valve, goes into the left ventricle. The left ventricle is stronger, more powerful. It squeezes and produces significant pressure that pushes through the next semilunar valve, which is the aortic valve, which pushes the blood up and into the aorta. As a note here, by the way, this is the blood flowing through the heart. But the heart is also a large muscular tissue. It needs blood itself, and it doesn't get it through the blood pumping through it. So it needs arteries to deliver blood and veins to draw the blood out from the coronary muscles, the myocardium. We'd used that word before. Myo just means muscle, and cardium means heart. So heart muscles. We need arteries that will deliver blood. So as soon as it goes out of that aortic valve, there's an artery that taps off, actually multiple arteries that tap off right there, draw blood out of the circulating system to deliver blood to the heart muscle itself. So the heart muscle gets its oxygenated blood from basically off-ramps right after the aortic valve that deliver blood to the heart's muscle tissue. And then veins would draw that blood out of the muscle tissue and return it back into circulation, right? Okay, this all works as a combined process, of course, so we've talked about it step by step, but basically what we've got is the arterioles squeezing at the same time. They push blood into the ventricles then squeeze, and the arterioles create what's called an arterial kick. What I mean is the goal of the, not the arterioles, sorry, the atria create an atrial kick, Jesus. And the goal there is to just make sure we get a nice fill, a full fill of the ventricles. If the ventricles are fully filled, they're going to be much more effective at pumping blood. In fact, we want to kind of stretch the ventricles a little bit because it turns out the ventricles pump significantly more blood if the muscle tissue is kind of stretched. Then when you get the constriction, when they pump out, you're going to get a nice stretching, and that's going to create a good push out. And that's what we need, right? We need a healthy heart that's creating a good push. Okay, remember that blood is going to flow out of the heart going up. So we sometimes talk about the apex of the heart, and you might think the apex of the heart is the top of the heart. No, the apex of the heart is the bottom of the heart, because the bottom of the heart is where that process begins. So those ventricles don't just squeeze all at once. The squeezing starts at the bottom, and they squeeze up like a tube of toothpaste, pushing the blood out and up, either into the lungs if it's the right side of the heart, or into the circulatory system if it's the left side of the heart, right? This is why the left side of the heart is stronger, and the ventricles on the left are stronger. Okay, and then all that surrounded by the pericardial sac so that that movement doesn't disturb the surrounding tissue or create irritation with the surrounding tissue. And then we've got some ways, just to note here, that allow us to identify whether or not the heart is working well and how well it's working. So cardiologists might be interested in things like obviously your heart rate. The faster your heart rate, the more blood is flowing out to some degree, though extreme fast heart rates do not increase blood flow. What this means is if you go out for a run or something like that, you can expect your heart rate to increase. So maybe your resting heart rate is probably somewhere between 60 and 100 beats per minute, and then you go out for a run, it gets up to 160 beats per minute. Okay, that's fine, that's good. If it gets up to 200 something beats per minute, that's not good, and actually that's reducing the efficiency and effectiveness of your heart. So cardiologists might measure cardiac output, that is how much blood is flowing out of your heart. They might measure something like ejection fraction, which is basically how much of your ventricles actually gets pumped out with every squeeze. In other words, are the ventricles efficiently pushing the blood out of the heart? Do you care about all this? Not too much, though it would be good to remember that a normal heart rate is about 60 to 100 beats per minute, right? Here's an image for you that gives you some sense of what this looks like. You can see in this image the tricuspid valve there on the left and the mitral valve there on the right of the left image. That is showing you those two large valves. And then you can also see the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve there too. That's the blood that would be flowing out of the ventricles. And if you look at the image on the lower right, you can see what those valves look like when they're open. And if you look inside, basically, the picture there on the lower right, what you'll notice is that there's some fibrous tissue that is connected to the valve leaves. And those are called chordae tendineae, and they are there to make sure that those leaves don't flip backwards. They're there to sort of maintain the mechanical integrity of the heart valves. So you can imagine how that works, right? You got these leaves, the 3 leaves or the 2 leaves of the mitral valve that are flipping like this. You don't want them to go blump back that way. So you've basically got firm connective tissue that allows for movement but doesn't allow the valves to go in the wrong direction. Okay, so the next thing we might note here, and this image shows it clearly, is to remind you that the left side of the heart does more work and it's going to be burlier. So here's an image that kind of shows you the thicker tissue on the left ventricle than on the right ventricle. And that makes sense because it's going to work harder. And in fact, one aspect of heart disease might be hypertrophy, which basically means excess growth of tissue. So here's a cut section, if you'd like, cutting through the heart. You can see it from the top of that left ventricle when it's hypertrophic. That is, when it's grown way too much. Why would something like that happen? Well, if you've got high blood pressure, that might happen because your heart muscle has to work really hard to push against that high blood pressure. And as a result of that, the muscle tissue grows. That's what happens when muscles are made to work. That's why you go to the gym. You work your muscles and you get larger muscles, right? Or more tone, more healthy, more fit muscles. In this case, this is not tone or healthy or fit. This is just excessive muscle growth because it's had to excessively work to push against a hard back pressure. The result of that is that the heart then can't pump effectively because you can't fill that ventricle with an adequate amount of blood. So an enlarged heart, either resulting from caused by this or caused by excessive inflammation from damage to the heart tissue, is not going to help your heart pump. Now, the muscle tissue itself, is worth noting, has to be sort of special, and we're going to talk about the muscle tissue in another video, but also has to be oriented in a special way. So this image kind of shows you, just for the sake of you understanding, that the heart tissue isn't sort of randomly placed there. It has an alignment to it, and that alignment helps the heart pump from the apex, from the bottom upward, again, like a tube of toothpaste, to push the blood upward and out of the heart with some significant force. So the muscles are aligned to allow that ejection to take place efficiently. And then, as we talked about before, and it's shown in this image, we have coronary arteries, which you can see there, tap off of the aorta right after the valve. So you can kind of see there in the middle upper part of that image that you've got a valve there, right? And you've got these coronary arteries that are marked there that are on the surface of the heart, or rather integrated into the surface of the heart, tap off as off ramps right before the aorta, right after the valve, and they're delivering oxygenated blood. They're taking some of the blood that the heart's pumping and delivering it to the heart muscle itself. This is important to recognize because one of the major forms of heart disease is that these arteries get clogged up, atherosclerosis. And that clogging means that the heart muscles no longer get adequate oxygen, and the result of that is the heart muscles suffer from first hypoxia, lack of oxygen, and then death as a result of that. And now you've got dead tissue in your heart and your heart's not functioning properly. This is a major form of a heart attack. And I like this image because this image puts it all together. And you can see there the valves opening and closing. You can see that semilunar valve up there on top, opening and closing. You can see the tricuspid valve, and you can see the chordae tendineae right there that are kind of holding the valve in place and stopping it from flopping back the other direction. And you can easily imagine that there on the upper left, you've got the right atrium, which is drawing in blood from some of those openings on the top there, squeezing, pushing blood in. So every time that tricuspid valve opens there on the left, that's blood going into the right side of the heart, which, as you can see here, is a less beefy part of the heart, has less muscle tissue in it. From there, it's going to go out into the lungs. It's going to come back on the image's left side, the image's right side, which is the left side of the heart. It's going to go through the mitral valve, a bicuspid valve, so 2 cusp instead of 3. Why? Because it's got to be a firmer, stronger valve because it's working with higher pressures. And so having 2 cusp is going to make it more resistant to backflow. It then, blood goes into the left ventricle. That left ventricle, you can kind of see there, is squeezing from the bottom up. Again, like a tube of toothpaste, squeezing from the apex up and pushing the blood out with some force into the circulatory system. That is the basic mechanics of the heart. In the next video, we'll talk about the electrical circuitry of the heart that controls this system, and then we're going to talk about heart diseases. In other words, what happens when some of these systems go wrong. Okay, I'll see you in those videos.